Hi, folks. My name is Omar Bimji. I'm the Town of Wolfville's Climate Change Mitigation Coordinator, and I'm going to be providing an update on the town's mobility planning project. We're covering 5 different areas. First, starting with the definition of mobility and talking about the rationale, what initiated this project. And we'll be talking about the 3 components of mobility that we're looking to focus on here. Provide some results from the community mobility survey that went out last fall, and then cover next steps where we go to from this point. So what is mobility? Mobility we take to mean having meaningful transportation opportunities, safe, affordable, and dependable ways to get where you need to or want to go. It's a little bit different from transportation. A bicycle is a form of transportation, but not if you're taking a longer trip or you need to carry quite a bit of stuff. Transit, bus is a form of transportation, but if it's not accessible, then it doesn't provide mobility to someone with a wheelchair or another barrier that might restrict them from getting on and off the bus. So really focusing on that idea of meaningful transportation opportunities that get people around and where they need to go. The rationale for this came from 2 different places. The first is the town's new municipal planning strategy that was adopted last September. There was a strong focus in there on active and sustainable forms of transportation, and it created policies for the town and for council on building cost-effective infrastructure that would encourage people and enable them to get around through active and sustainable means, that would focus the town on building the infrastructure that promoted those ways of getting around, and would prioritize building an active transportation network and investments in associated hardware. The rationale also came directly from council. We were given as staff direction back in May of 2020 to include in that year's operations plan a project that focused on identifying meaningful active transportation improvements and bringing forth recommendations for longer term inclusion in budgets and operation plan moving forward. And that's really what this process is looking to identify and put for council. The 3 components of this work are active transportation, and walking and cycling are mainly the focus there. And for this, we're working with Bicycle Nova Scotia on an update to the town's active transportation plan and design for a comprehensive network of trails and paths and other facilities throughout the town. Going to be looking a little later this year at public transit, conducting a feasibility study for a high-frequency community transit program here in Wolfville. And we'll be looking at crosswalk safety at a more technical level, working with an engineering firm on a systematic review of Wolfville's pedestrian crossing facilities and crosswalks to prioritize and identify improvements that can be made to those facilities. Really, the drive behind a lot of this is coming from a consultation process that we're in the middle of now. We sent out a mobility survey a little bit earlier this year, and that's what I'm going to focus on first. Community mobility survey went out as an online survey, and we looked at doing paper surveys as well, but determined, talking to different community groups and partners, that we could get this out in front of a lot of different parts of the community meaningfully without the lack of a paper survey being a real barrier. Used a lot of different ways and communication channels to get it out, from more traditional communication means to social media, working with neighborhood groups and stakeholders to use their communication channels to get it out to as far and wide and as many different parts of the community as possible. And we got over 400 returns on the survey. It was open for about 2 months, and we wanted to keep it open for longer to make sure that we were able to get into all the nooks and crannies and make sure it was in front of as many different folks and members of the community as possible to get a really broad and comprehensive return on the questions we were asking. Postal codes collected suggests that we did a pretty good job with that. We managed to get it in front of parts of the community from across town. And yeah, the geographic distribution gave us a sense that we were able to at least connect with different parts of the community in a pretty good way, get responses from them. So one of the main questions that we asked through the survey was where people in Wolfville traveled. And there we're looking at frequently traveled to destinations, so places that people went every day or at least a few times a week. Unsurprisingly, the downtown area was the most frequently traveled to destination in town, with over 90% of respondents telling us that they visited it every day or at least a few times a week. The west end of town and the east end of town were also very popular destinations for frequent travel. The university, with over half of respondents telling us that they went there, again, at least a few times a week, and other residential neighborhoods, not specifically, but gave us a good sense that folks in Wolfville are frequently visiting other residences or neighborhoods in town and making trips between different parts of the community that way. Another question we wanted to look into was how people were getting around. So we asked about 4 different modes of travel. The most frequently used form of transportation seemed to be walking or getting around on foot, with about 76, 77% of respondents telling us that they always or often used walking to get around town for trips within Wolfville. Cars and taxis were another popular mode of transportation, with about 65, 66% of respondents telling us that they always or often used a car to get around town. Bicycle was a little less frequently used. We only had a couple of people who told us that they always cycled for travel in Wolfville, and maybe about 23, 24% telling us that they at least often used a bicycle for trips within the town. Transit was definitely the least common form of transportation used by folks in Wolfville. We had over 80% of respondents telling us that they never used the bus, at least for trips within town, and a small percentage, about 6 or 7, who told us that they often or always use the bus to get around the town itself. We dug a little deeper into each of these different modes. For each one, depending on whether you told us that you often or always used it, or if you rarely or never used it, we had follow-up questions around what might be motivating you to choose that form of transportation, or what barriers or deterrents you might be facing if you rarely or never faced that or used that form of transportation. What might be the other side of encouragement. So for walking, we heard most frequently that for folks who didn't walk or rarely walked, it was a lack of convenience that really informed that. The distance and hills were also a factor. Physical limitations or disabilities, inclement weather. Those were the main reasons or deterrents that kept people from walking for trips within Wolfville. When it came to cycling, the number one reason that folks told us they didn't ride was simply that they didn't have a bike. Beyond that, it was issues like the hill in town, safety concerns, a lack of confidence, a lack of separated bike lanes. Those were other very popular reasons, around 20 to 25%, why people told us they didn't choose to ride for trips within Wolfville. Beyond just looking at the deterrents, we asked folks to characterize themselves as cyclists. So tell us a little bit about their relationship to cycling. Everything from being strong and fearless, folks who are willing to ride under any circumstances at all times, and the no way, no how, folks who don't ride their bikes in town and would prefer not to do so. The largest segment of this is what is often referred to as the near market for cycling. Interested but concerned residents who would like to ride more for trips in Wolfville, but are hesitant, going back to some of those barriers that I talked about before. And when we broke out those barriers for that particular group, so for the respondents who told us they were interested but concerned about something related to cycling, we got some different answers about the barriers. So safety concerns for that group were number one, hills, confidence, and a lack of dedicated cycling facilities were other common reasons. And then not having a bike was still a reason, but a little less commonly cited than in the general public. When it came to transit, we were looking less for barriers keeping people from using transit and more for what kinds of changes or improvements could be made that might encourage folks to use transit. The most common change, or the most commonly cited variable that would encourage people to use more transit, was more frequent service, having more trips and more regular trips in town. We also had a fair number of people tell us that they couldn't see themselves using a bus under current or sort of foreseeable circumstances for trips in Wolfville. Some folks told us that if they were traveling longer distances, it might make sense, and other issues or factors came in there as well. Beyond just ticking boxes and making selections in our survey, we wanted to give respondents an opportunity to provide a bit of unstructured qualitative feedback or input. So there's an area where we just asked people to provide their comments on issues related to transportation or mobility or anything else that was on their mind. And we those comments pretty rigorously and coded them, looking for themes, trends, issues that we may not have identified on our own, but that residents wanted to tell us about when it came to thinking about these matters. The number one message we received through unstructured comments was a request for more and improved bike lanes. This was often from young families looking at riding around Wolfville with their children, especially, and not feeling that the current facilities were safe enough for them to do so. We also had requests for improved, more frequent transit services in town, especially during the winter or periods of more inclement weather. We had a number of concerns around accessibility or the lack of accessibility that still is present in town. Some generally positive comments, and then some negative but often constructive comments about the Main Street pilot project from the summer of 2020. So that was the first stage of the consultation process, that community mobility survey. Right now, we are trying to have more in-depth and substantive conversations with stakeholder groups and community groups that we've identified to dig a little bit more into what we've heard and discuss some of the mobility planning stuff that we're working on. We had meetings, really constructive meetings with the university population and the students. We've brought this issue and had some good conversations with the town's citizen advisory committees, so folks on the accessibility committee, the planning advisory committee, and the environmental sustainability committee. Had a great conversation with folks on the Eastern Kings Community Health Board, looking at mobility and transportation and accessibility from a community health perspective. And we're lining up meetings with the Wolfville school community and the Wolfville Business Development Corporation to discuss what mobility and transportation in town means to and for them. That's about it. Thanks for tuning in. Hope I was able to give you a bit of an overview of what we're working on and a sense of what's coming down the pipe. Questions or want to discuss anything in this presentation or the town's work, please don't hesitate to get in touch. My email address is up there on the top left-hand side of the screen. Thanks.